Hi there, I'm Des Asante, the founder of the Tech Muse Academy, and welcome to this TrackSpark tutorial. Today, what I wanted to get into with you is the concept of three-dimensional placement and the three-dimensional sound stage in your mix. This is information that when I first started to wrap my head around it, really revolutionized the quality that I was getting in my home studio. And I'm hoping that it'll trigger a couple of aha moments with you as well. And you'll be able to take this information back to your own projects and actually get a better sound, a more clear and punchy presentation from your mixes by simply avoiding the tendency for elements to step on one another's toes and mask each other out, making sure that each element in your mix has a very specific and determined place and that can be heard to the level that it needs to be to enhance the musical expression, okay? So first, let's start with a little bit of theory. Let's define the three dimensions first. The most obvious one that comes to mind is the horizontal dimension. The horizontal dimension is simply your panning, your panorama strategy. So where from left to right are you going to place elements? There's a little bit less mystery involved there. I imagine that that's something you've been playing with great confidence since you pretty much started with the music production process. But it is something to be considered from the perspective of three-dimensional placement and making sure that everything has its own space to exist, okay? As opposed to just slinging something to the left or slinging something to the right, having a strategy behind it is important to consider. The second dimension is the depth dimension, from near to far, and not just where something is in relationship to the listener distance-wise, but also how big is the space that sound exists in. For example, you could have an element in your mix that is very upfront and intimate sounding and close to the listener, okay? Or you could have something that sounds as though it's 20 feet back. Now, when you have something that sounds as though it's 20 feet back, is it 20 feet back in a 20-foot room or 20 feet back in a 100-foot room? So that's what I mean by where is the element in relationship to the listener and what is the size of the space that element exists in. Those are the two things to consider when it comes to your depth dimension. We use typically reverbs and delays as our primary tools to deal with the depth dimension. And then last but not least, we have the vertical dimension. Now, the vertical dimension was a little bit less obvious to me back in the early days, but it's basically dealing with frequency distribution. So as an example, high frequencies, high-pitched sounds, a shrill violin, something like that, are typically perceived in the head, in the upper regions of your body. And low bass frequencies, kick drums, bass synths, drops, things like that, are perceived down low in the gut area. So with this knowledge, you can begin to strategize where along the vertical spectrum you want your elements to exist, or where they naturally exist simply by the sound, the timbre that they are. For example, a hi-hat is not going to sit down very low ever because it just doesn't have that much low frequency content. A bass guitar is not going to ever sit too high because of the opposite, of course, as well. Okay, so when you consider these three dimensions and then you apply this to your mix, what you're able to do is get clarity and definition between all of the elements in the mix. So let's take a listen to a tune that I was working on recently off of my debut album that I put out with my lovely lady Carol. We go by Des and Carol, desandcarol.com if you're interested in the music and want to have a listen. But this is a tune called Where I Should Not Be. I'll just play a couple of bars of it first so you can get a feel for what we're dealing with.
No, I can't say this of anybody else. No one makes me feel like I know it all again. Inside out and upside down, and again till I see clear again.
Okay, so it's an acoustic rock kind of number, and I figure what we'll do is we'll focus on these background vocals as an example of manipulating placement. Let's have a listen to them.
Says we'll see when we're there.
Okay, let's hear them in solo. Okay, so a couple of things I want you to notice is that you'll notice that when I solo these vocals, they sound very dull, very almost muffled a little bit, right? And they're also spread left and right. There's two tracks that we're listening to here, and they're spread hard left and hard right. So that was the panorama strategy, was just to get them as far out of the way of the lead vocal as possible. And if you hear that with the lead vocal,
says we'll see when we're there.
Okay, you hear the lead vocal comes clear down the center and the harmonies are way off to the wings so as they to not get in the way of the star of the show, which is typically the lead vocal. Okay, the other thing is that the reason why they sound so round and warm. In fact, I'll pull up on the screen so you can see.
Says we'll see when we're there.
Okay, so I have those two tracks routed to a stereo fader so I can treat them both simultaneously. So you'll notice that what's happening here is, first of all, I've got a bit of compression on the vocals, and that is the purpose of the compression was to bring up the softer parts, the lower volume parts of the vocal, so that there's more clarity and definition to the words, okay? It wasn't to make them louder, it was to bring up the subtle nuances, okay? And then the other thing I have is a stereo imager, which is designed to make them even wider still, further outside of the way of the lead vocal. Let's have a listen with and without.
Says we'll see when we're there.
And without.
Says we'll see when we're there.
With.
Says we'll see when we're there.
Okay, so that was to further accentuate my horizontal spectrum decision. My strategy was to get them as wide outside as the lead vocal as possible. Now, secondarily, I wanted to also push them back from the lead vocal as well. So what I did in that regard was there is a psychoacoustic phenomenon that takes place, and that is simply the physics of sound and how it affects the auditory system. Okay, that's what I mean by psychoacoustics. In physical reality, the high frequency content has less energy than low frequency content, which means that the further the sound travels, the less high frequency content exists because it's lost its energy previously. The low frequencies will travel further. So with that in mind, if you want to create the illusion that something is further away, one great thing to do, it's very simple, is to roll off some of the high end, which would not have made it to the listener's ear if indeed the sound source was that far away. So you'll notice I have a low pass filter here at about 3K that's rolling off most of the high end. Let's have a listen to it with and without. So this is with the filter on.
Says we'll see when we're there.
And without.
Says we'll see when we're there.
With.
Says we'll see when we're there.
So you'll notice that as soon as I disengage that low pass filter, the background vocals all of a sudden become more present. They become more upfront, okay? And as a creative decision, you may or may not want that. In my case, I wanted them to be a little bit further back. I wanted them to be a little bit less in the way of the lead vocal. That's me singing, and I don't have a real strong, pop rock voice or anything like that. So I use this as a mixed decision to help my vocal stand out a little bit better, okay? Now, the other thing I have done is I've rolled off the low end as well, and I do that for basically, you'll know, if you were to watch me mix a number of sessions, you'll realize that I almost use as many high pass filters or low cut filters as there are tracks in my mix. I find that every track, even if you're recording a triangle, it's got low end information in the recording that's not musically relevant. So I get rid of that. But also the high pass filter will tend to control the thickness or girth of the sound source. So if we listen to the vocals together.
Says we'll see when we're there.
Now I'll turn it off.
Says we'll see when we're there.
You notice how they sound heavy. They sound too heavy now as weight. I don't mean like heavy metal. I mean, there's too much weight to them, okay? Again, without the high pass, and then I'll bring it in.
Says we'll see when we're there.
Bring it back in.
Says we'll see when we're there.
Okay, so that just reduces their weight a little bit, and the low pass filter pushes them back a little bit. Next in line, we've got the effects sense, and let's have a listen to what they're doing.
Says we'll see when we're there.
Okay, so you notice I've got three effects that these background vocals are being sent to. One of them is my room reverb. So let me mute these two out for a second, and you'll hear it with just the room reverb.
And says we'll see when we're there.
Let me take them all out.
And says we'll see when we're there.
So very dry and very two-dimensional and kind of up front. Even though we've made other decisions to try to create the illusion of distance, we're not done yet. We haven't completed the illusion. So the first thing I do is I'll bring in my short tail reverb, my room reverb, and have a listen to what that sounds like without.
And says we'll see when we're there.
And with.
And says we'll see when we're there.
Okay, that's a subtle one. And then we'll bring in our long tail plate reverb. Let's have a listen.
And says we'll see when we're there.
Bringing it in.
And says we'll see when we're there. And says we'll see.
Okay, and we'll bring in our delay. I've got just a little bit of a slap delay on this just to make them a little bit wider, a little bit bigger in terms of their perceived presence. Have a listen with the delay.
And says we'll see when we're there. Says we'll see when we're there.
Okay, now let's hear how these compare without any of these treatments. I'll bypass the EQ and the effects, and we'll hear them together.
And says we'll see when we're there. And says we'll see when we're there.
Let's bring in the compressor and the widener.
And says we'll see when we're there.
Thin them out.
Says we'll see when we're there.
Push them back.
And says we'll see when we're there.
Add the ambience.
And says we'll see when we're there.
Okay, so hopefully that makes some sense to you. The important thing to consider is that there are three dimensions, even though there are only two speakers, and understanding some of the tools that are used to make decisions and manipulate audio within those three dimensions. Bearing in mind, your horizontal is just your panning and stereo enhancement effects. I've utilized both in this example. Your vertical placement is frequency content, so high frequencies are perceived up here, low frequencies down here, and then your depth dimension, which is sort of what we focused on today, because that's the one that I think a lot of people get wrong. When you consider reverb and delay, don't necessarily consider it just as an effect. Consider it as a tool to create a psychoacoustic illusion of precise placement in your mix. Okay, if you found this interesting and you want to dig deeper into the subject and really up your mix game, head on over to mixlessons.com and take the free course that is available there. It's a video training series. I believe TrackSpark will probably provide links for you at somewhere on this page, I imagine. And I want to thank TrackSpark for letting me chime in with some thoughts for you guys, and hopefully I'll see you again soon.